On behalf of the American Enterprise Institute, I want to welcome everyone to our latest web event, The Future of Remote Work, Balancing the Trade-Offs. This event is a follow-up to the report we published late last month titled The Trade-Offs of Remote Work, Building a More Resilient Workplace for the Post-COVID-19 World. Throughout the event, if you have any questions, please email them to me at matthew.ledger@aei.org and follow along at Twitter at #remoteworkAEI. My name is Matt Ledger. I'm a research analyst in the domestic policy department here at AEI. I'm joined by my boss and colleague, Brent Urell. Together, Brent and I spearheaded the research and publication of this report, and we're excited to be hosting you today. Brent is a resident fellow at AEI, where he works on job training, workforce development, and criminal justice reform. Specifically, his research focuses on expanding opportunity for all Americans through work readiness and job training and improving the criminal justice system. Before joining AEI, Mr. Urell worked in the executive and legislative branches of the US government for over 20 years. He was nominated by President George to lead the Employment and Training Administration of the US Department of Labor, and he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Administration for Children and Families at the US Department of Health and Human Services. With that, Brent, I will hand it over to you to say hello to everyone.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Great to be with all of you here on the panel, as well as with our audience this morning. As Matt mentioned, I'm a resident fellow here at AEI, where I lead research on topics related to vocational calling, career development, work, and criminal justice reform. For those of you who aren't familiar with AEI, we're a public policy think tank dedicated to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world. The work of our scholars and staff advances ideas rooted in our belief in democracy, free enterprise, American strength and global leadership, solidarity with those at the periphery of our society, and a pluralistic entrepreneurial culture. In my over 2 years here at AEI, few topics that we've sought to address have generated as much interest as remote work. And the reasons for this are clear. The past 9 months, the US has moved from an economy where only a small fraction of workers, around 7%, were working remotely, to one where between 25 and 30% of American workers are working away from traditional offices. This is a sea change in work habits that can only have been the result of the need to protect workers from infection by the COVID virus. The vast American economy has, in effect, become a real-time, natural experiment in remote work. Our report on this topic is not intended to give a detailed analysis of what's happened, which I think will require years to achieve and keep many researchers and academics fully employed in the pursuit of that understanding. Rather, our report is intended to provide a foundation for the existing research on the topic, as well as some insights into how the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated trends that were already underway before the disease struck. To help us explore this today, Matt Ledger, an AEI research analyst, and I have assembled a panel of expert researchers and practitioners in the remote workspace to respond to our report and engage you in a conversation on the topic. Our first panelist is Laurel Ferrer, who is the founder of Distribute Consulting and the Remote Work Association. Laurel starts, strengthens, and leverages virtual workforces to solve corporate and socioeconomic concerns. She's a global thought leader on the topic of remote work and collaborates with the world's leading businesses and governments to eliminate virtual worker discrimination, prevent policy retraction, increase remote job accessibility, train distributed leaders, and design economic initiatives. Additionally, she also shares her expertise as a Forbes contributor, subject matter expert for business education curriculum, and a virtual software product advisor. We're also joined by Dr. Nicole Turner Lee, who is a senior fellow in governance studies and the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Lee researches public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology across the US and to harness its power to create change in communities across the world. Dr. Lee has a forthcoming book on the U.S. divide titled Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. That's forthcoming this year, 2021, from Brookings Press. She sits on various U.S. federal agency and civil society boards. She has a PhD and an MA from Northwestern University and graduated from Colgate University. Krista Makritis serves as a research professor at the W.P. Carney School of Business in Arizona at Arizona State University. He's a digital fellow at the Initiative on the Digital Economy at the MIT Sloan School of Management and a digital fellow at the Digital Economy Lab at Stanford University. Christos previously served on the White House Council of Economic Advisors, managing cybersecurity, technology, and space activities, and was a non-resident fellow at the Cybersecurity Project in the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Christos' primary academic research focuses on labor economics, behavioral economics, the digital economy, and personal finance and well-being. He earned a bachelor's in economics and a minor in math at Arizona State, as well as dual masters and PhDs in economics and management science and engineering at Stanford University. So with that, I'm going to hand the presentation of the report over to Matt to walk us through the main points of its content. Then we'll have each of our panelists give a response to the report from their perspective, engage in a little bit of panel discussion, and then open for Q&A. So Matt, let's get started on this. Hang on.
Good. All right. Thank you, Brent. All right. So in the, if you want to just start on the next slide, Brent. So in the face of stay-at-home orders and economic shutdowns, millions of employers and employees were forced to do their jobs at home in isolation. Employers that had experience with remote work were more easily able to make this transition, while others were left scrambling to distribute their workforces on an extremely accelerated timeline. A remote work evolution that was supposed to take decades happened over the course of just a few short weeks. Next slide, please. Before the pandemic, remote work was gaining in popularity, but was mostly reserved for a portion of the highly educated and highly paid knowledge workers of our economy. COVID provided a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to experiment with remote work on a massive scale. Now, a new headline emerges every week about another company announcing plans to continue remote work into the future. Estimates suggest that upwards of 30% of the workforce will continue to work remotely at least part-time after the pandemic subsides, a notable drop from the pandemic high point of about 50%, but a significant increase compared to pre-COVID levels. While it appears that this remote work experiment was largely successful, it may be years before we fully understand how this shift has impacted workers, employers, and broader society. Next slide, please. There have been countless studies on remote work, but given its minimal impact before the pandemic relative to in-office work, there's still a lot we do not know. Our goal for this report was to pull together the existing research on remote work to try to make sense of all that we know so far, with a particular focus on understanding the positive and negative trade-offs faced by both employers and employees. We also wanted to shed light on the critical barriers in a way of an equitable shift to remote work and to point towards areas of needed research. And we will now briefly walk through some of the report's findings. So employers face some pretty hefty trade-offs with remote work. On the positive end, the bulk of evidence on remote work's impact points towards remote work helping to increase productivity. At the very least, productivity does not waver from that of in-office work. Companies can also experience operational cost savings in the form of reduced real estate and building maintenance costs. Savings can also be found in the human resources, training, and recruitment functions, as remote workers often have far lower turnover rates. On that note, remote work-friendly companies have a recruitment advantage. Even before the pandemic, the workforce was increasingly seeking out jobs with at least partial remote work options. Additionally, for companies that struggle to fill critical skills gaps, remote work provides an opportunity to expand their recruitment capacity, perhaps even globalize their search for talent. As we learned from the pandemic, remote work helps to bolster resilience in the face of major disruptions such as natural disasters. And also an added benefit of remote work is that companies can curb their environmental impact by reducing their real estate footprint and waste production, and by keeping their employees out of cars and off the road. On the flip side, employers risk losing or at least diminishing organizational culture. There are many creative ways companies have deployed digital tools during the pandemic to help maintain some level of team cohesion and social activity, but these tools simply cannot serve to replace face-to-face human interaction. Additionally, transitioning to a remote work model can make management of staff and monitoring work activities more difficult. If nothing else, it requires a rethinking of how productivity is measured, which requires an operational and a cultural shift. Also, quite simply, not everyone likes to work remotely, and not everyone's job is a good fit for remote work. So shaping a remote work policy that works for everyone can be a difficult task. And trying to do so can ultimately complicate matters further and inhibit the success of telework expansion. It's also important to point out that a distributed workforce can increase exposure to cybersecurity risks, requiring companies bolster their defenses against nefarious actors. Lastly, one little talked about negative impact of remote work is the effect that it can have on workers who are stuck in the office. In-office workers have shown to experience dips in their own productivity and have reported a loss of team cohesion when working with remote colleagues. This can in turn negatively impact their own career advancement or simply job satisfaction. Next slide, please. Employees likewise have some trade-offs to manage. Research shows that remote workers are more satisfied with their jobs, which can have positive impacts on their personal lives. With less time commuting and more time to spend at home with family or taking on hobbies, remote work gives workers back invaluable time. Working remotely can also make people healthier. Long commutes have been shown to increase stress levels that can lead to poor health. Reducing or outright eliminating commutes can help to minimize these health risks among the workforce. Additionally, without a commute, employees can sleep longer and have more time to exercise, all things that help to make them happier, healthier, and more productive. Employees can also save money on vehicle and transportation related costs and eating out for lunch. They can also reduce costs associated with requiring professional clothing. Some studies have shown that workers can save anywhere from $2,000 to $6,500 annually when transitioning from in-office to remote work. And lastly, within the bounds that their job allows, workers benefit from increased autonomy to work at times and in conditions they are most comfortable, helping them to perform at their very best. Unfortunately, there's a dark side to working remotely. Many workers struggle to separate work life and home life when they happen in the same place, which can lead to burnout in some instances. While commutes can be detrimental to people's health, they sometimes serve as a separation tool that helps put a definitive end to the workday. Working remotely can also increase a sense of social isolation that can be detrimental to an individual's mental health, and it can be difficult for workers to enjoy their jobs when they aren't doing it alongside their work friends. As the pandemic has dragged on, research has shown that workers are starting to feel the strain from prolonged isolation, and that it may be offsetting the health benefits they initially got from the opportunity to work remotely. In addition to preventing face time with friends and colleagues, remote work also prevents employees from getting valuable face time with their managers and superiors. Some studies have shown that this can negatively impact a worker's ability to climb their career ladder. Then there's the phenomena of Zoom fatigue, which we are all likely familiar with at this point. And of course, there's the issue of inconsistent communication with teammates through digital channels. Lastly, with the explosion of remote work comes more job opportunities for people, but it also comes with increased competition for those jobs. The competition for talent is no longer restricted to the geographic boundaries of an organization's office location, so many workers in search of remote jobs have to match up against a broader talent pool. In some cases, workers may also develop a sense of fear that they'll lose their job to someone that's quote unquote more affordable somewhere else. Next slide, please. So a recurring theme throughout this presentation is that working remotely works most of the time, but not always, and it often works for a lot of people, but not everyone. In several case studies highlighted in the report, workers who were given the option to work remotely or in office were most productive when they self-sorted into the scenario that worked best for them individually. Additionally, we can maximize the benefits of remote work and minimize the downsides by staggering the work week with a mix of in-office and remote work. Combined, this hybrid work model can help our economy and society balance these trade-offs. However, it's important to note that in the face of remote work's rising popularity, even before the pandemic, many organizations attempted to keep up with the trend and rapidly developed their own programs. However, they quickly found themselves reversing those policies, discovering that the arrangement didn't work for them. So as the pandemic drags on and remote work policies become more permanent, we may find that in the rush to maximize the benefits, we may ultimately find some cracks in the model. So while this may cause short-term pain for many employers, it will ultimately help our economy reach a satisfactory equilibrium. Next slide, please. So while remote work is becoming the new normal, there are some serious hurdles to overcome in order to ensure an equitable shift to this working model. The first is disparities in broadband access that continue to persist across the country. While some progress has been made in this area, still a long way to go in bridging the digital divide. There's also a challenge which we've called the corporate digital divide. This refers to the stark divide in access to digital tools between smaller businesses and larger enterprises. If we think about these issues as part of the infrastructure that helps businesses grow and thrive, it makes sense to consider how the government can support and incentivize smaller firms in gaining access to digital tools to help them enable digital operations. Lastly, not everyone has access to comfortable at-home work environments to do their jobs remotely. For some, it can be simply a lack of privacy. For others, it could be a lack of space. Others may have more serious issues that prevent them from being able to work remotely in an efficient manner. These are broader systemic issues that must be addressed as we continue to expand remote work options going forward. Next slide, please. And so before taking our findings into consideration, we felt it important to point out that there are limitations to what we know about remote work based on the research that's been conducted to date. The studies done so far have been limited in scope and scale, often focusing on one particular company or industry and not necessarily representative of all companies or industries. Most studies were also conducted within companies that were friendly towards remote work and were more willing to experiment. These companies also often had a workflow that worked well with the remote work model, skewing results heavily towards positive outcomes. A lot of the research was also focused on work done in isolation that did not require much collaboration, communication, or teamwork. This means we do not know much about how team-based work is impacted when shifting to a remote setting. Lastly, there are virtually no longitudinal studies on the impact of remote work on employers or employees. This leaves a significant gap in our knowledge about how the positive or negative impacts of remote work change over time. Excuse me. Additionally, we've been given an opportunity to experiment with remote work thanks to COVID-19, but because of the pandemic and the economic and social disruptions that have come with it, our experiments may ultimately be impacted by these external stressors. It's important to account for these impacts when evaluating the effectiveness of remote work during this time. Next slide, please. So moving forward, policymakers can serve as a partner to industry in three ways. First, by examining laws and regulations that incentivize or discourage remote work and considering new opportunities for reform. Second, the government can play a supportive role by assessing the impact of remote work and educating business leaders across sectors to inform them when shaping remote work policies. And lastly, the government should invest in research and evaluations that improve our understanding of how remote workers can best be supported through and beyond this digital transformation we're all experiencing. And with that, we will hand over to Brent to do the panel discussion.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Well done summarizing the report. So now we want to just turn to our panelists, who we, of course, provided the report to ahead of time, asked them to read it, give it some thought. Each of them comes at this from a somewhat different angle. So I want to give them a few minutes just to touch on what they perceive within the report as being consistent or inconsistent with their own perspectives, or additional insights that might be useful for the audience. So I think we'll start with Laurel and just have her, as somebody who's been working closely with all sorts of companies and people that are attempting to adapt to the new normal, and give us her thoughts on what we're learning about remote work and her thoughts on the report.
Thank you. Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is all come to a very mutual understanding and agreement that what we're experiencing right now is not remote work. What we're experiencing right now as a global society is a workplace contingency plan to respond to an international pandemic. So the conditions that we're working in are not the conditions that I'm used to. I've been working remotely for 14 years. This year has still been astronomically stressful and different for me as well. Never in the history of remote work have we ever had to work from home, learn from home, be teachers and employees at the same time, worship from home, shop from home. All of that has never existed before. So this is not ideal circumstances. So if decision makers or employees are feeling stressed or wondering how in the world do people do this all the time, They don't do this all the time. This is not remote work. So that's really critical for all of us to start this conversation, to understand that long-term in a conversation about sustainability of remote work, there is much more control over prevention strategies for the barriers that were discussed in the report. So problems like micromanagement, isolation, burnout. When we have an opportunity to come into this model of working with intention, preparation, and planning, those are all barriers that are quite easy to prevent if you know how. And but because the entire world came into this with no preparation, no intention, no planning, you don't know what you don't know. And so they didn't know how to prevent, people from feeling informationally isolated, socially isolated. People are complaining of, well, I'm alone all day, every day. Well, yeah, so am I. Am I usually in 2019 and beyond? No. Most remote workers are working from co-working spaces. If they don't have an ideal home office environment, they go to a co-working space. If they feel lonely because they're not around their coworkers all the time, they have a strong and healthy and dynamic social life. Like, there is so much stress and dynamics and elements to life in general that are causing more stress and pressure. Yes, things like burnout, right? Burnout is a common problem for remote workers, but who's not feeling burned out right now? Like, we've got a pandemic. We've got social injustice. We've had one of the most stressful national elections of all time. Like, we're all burned out regardless of what's happening at work. So I think it's very, very important to clarify what's happening right now are abnormal circumstances. The difference is when we start going back to work or things start opening back up to normal, what has happened right now at an organizational level is a workplace change. If people want to prevent the barriers that are discussed in the report and access the benefits that are discussed in the report, they have to come into this with intention and planning, like I said. And what that means is thinking about this as a virtual organizational development change management process. So you are impacting, changing, influencing all facets of your organization, workflows, processes, expectations, resources. All of those have to be updated in order to start operating as a virtual organization, because that's what went wrong historically in those reports that you referenced, where there was retraction policies. They continued to operate as usual as a physical co-located company, while some people were working off-site, and that's what created worker discrimination and imbalanced employee experience and siloed information. So when we're thinking about it sustainably, we have the opportunity to think about it with intention, planning, and preparation. It's going to be a very different ballgame.
Very good. I've got about 5 questions based on what you said, but we'll hold those for right now. Nicole, your thoughts?
I don't have anything else to say after Laurel, because I think she's completely right. Laurel, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to pay you as opposed to anybody else to actually talk through my stress right now when it comes to quote unquote not remote work. I think I can say your report is timely. I mean, Matt, Brent, you always bring in the right topics at the right time. I'm always happy to be a guest with you guys when you're putting out this research, Brent, on this, because the bottom line is, as Laurel said, this is not normal. For those of us who have worked remotely before, we've had much more control. I mean, it's so funny. My daughter recently said to me, if this is what people do as adults for a living, I don't want to do it. Because essentially all she sees me do is get on these presentations. And now I want to add to Laurel, we've actually seen, as in your report has suggested, even more intrusions on people's personal space, whether it's, as a parent being able to handle the fact that, I've got to figure out what room I'm in today. If my child is doing her schooling and my partner may be doing something else, or the dog may want his own space. The bottom line is I'm letting people into my home as well. And those actually have disparities. So you guys mentioned broadband, but I've often thought about in the beginning of this, I need to have a bookcase behind me, but my bookcase is downstairs, and have put out these very aggressive requests from my family to sort of help me shape the right space as if I'm in my office. And as Laurel said, I'm not. And I think it's important for us to realize that whatever we're going through right now is not the normal course of business when it comes to being able to have some of the freedoms of remote work provides. So I want to reflect upon the report. I think you're completely right. I mean, honestly, I have not, as an individual, really wanted to go back to having a commute. I mean, I think that also was very stressful in its own right here in Washington, D.C. So the ability to work from home actually added a couple of hours to my own productivity. I find myself getting up earlier than I would at any other time to basically use that time before people actually log on to the computer to do other things. At the same token, I also find that it has been helpful to be with my family. So I think some of the positives that Matt pointed out in the presentation speak to me. Last year around this time, I visited 7 countries and over 15 cities. This year, I've gone nowhere. And in fact, I've imported myself to places like India and Korea, which actually is great because I get to actually use the time I would have been on an airplane spending time with my family. And that actually has been, I think, an increased quality of life, although I think my kids are probably getting sick of me as much as I'm getting sick of them. But at the same token, I think that there are some physical adjustments that we've made, and some of them probably for the better. Now, what's the trade-off? I was just with my doctor the other day. We're not moving, as Laurel said. We're sitting in these same stationary spots. I'm sure in addition to what we're going to find long-term when it comes to work, we're going to find long-term trends in terms of health. Because of this immobility that we've all experienced, the fact that we're sitting and we're using our hands in certain ways, or we're not necessarily, therapeutic in how we actually manage this time, I think becomes more concerning. I find that folks like us probably do this really well. I don't know about my research associates at Brookings, the extent to which not having a direct leader down the hall to bounce off ideas works. If anything, I'll tell us a funny story. Our particular RA has moved from room to room to sort of figure out which is the best place as he shares apartment with other folks, right? In the beginning, just bought something, but it's things like that. I think this is really a privilege for people who have this ability to work at home. If you're a person who really cannot work at home because you're not necessarily in a big enough space, or you don't have the bandwidth in terms of broadband, or you have little kids running around. I mean, I was on a call yesterday and the poor woman was holding her daughter while she was presenting. These are the challenges that I think, to Laurel's point, like they're not necessarily the normal factors that we consider remote working. Remote working historically, I think, has always been around giving an employee some flexibility and independence to manage these life stressors and life goals, whether you're a new parent, whether you're a person whose job does not require you to come in, like many of us at a think tank. But that doesn't work for everybody. And I think it's important, I would add to Laurel's point, that companies also have values that are embedded in what this looks like. I mean, there's lots of discussion of companies that are not going to go back into the office or give people that option. But I also think that you have to have values. Work has to stop at 5 o'clock. There are so many people like myself who start at 6 and we're still going until 6 the next morning, simply because we're now attached to this communication culture that assumes that you are always available via video, you're always online, and you can manage the plethora of other responsibilities that you have. And I also want to point out one last thing that you all said in this report that I think is really important. We're also assuming that everybody has broadband. I find it to be interesting, right, as a person who focuses on this, that, we always think it's people who are disproportionately poor or of color or older that don't have broadband. There are some folks that live in rural areas that are on panels with me, and their broadband is kicking out the same way that others. That's why I call my book The New Underclass, because folks, based on where you live, do not have access. And there are people like ourselves. I literally find my bill higher than it's ever been, in all my utilities, but I had to also get an extender because having multiple people online at the same time was stressing my own network. And I live relatively close to a lot of connectivity means. So with that, I think you're right on with your report. I've not yet seen anyone that I know that has been very excited about being home this long. But I think it goes to what Laurel talks about. It's not necessarily the working at home, it's the working at home without boundaries. And I think that is that lack of structure and framework and values around what this actually means for companies that are considering, hey, this is a cost savings, we're not paying real estate, we're not doing this, that. We're also compromising some quality of life indicators that I think as you expand upon this research, Brent, will have greater effects, because loneliness is real. I just happen to have kids, and where you live is real, and the circumstances in which you actually are encased in this work environment are also real. So I'll end it there and look forward to the discussion.
That's terrific. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely on our agenda in terms of especially digging deep to the experiences of work. There'll be a lot of economic analysis on this, you know, in terms of productivity and, you know, GDP growth and a whole bunch of things. But what we don't want to get lost in this is sort of what's it look like from the standpoint of the people who are being most directly impacted in terms of the workforce. So thanks, Nicole, and I appreciate your thoughts. I've also got a couple questions that I want to develop for you. And speaking of questions for the audience, don't forget, if you've got something that you want to get into the queue, please send those to matthew.ledger@aei.org. And so we can have those on hand to get to the panelists. So last but certainly not least, Christos, you've done some quantitative work in this area, and I wanted to get your perspective on both the report and what you've heard from the other panelists too.
Definitely, and thank you again for the opportunity to participate in this. There's two main points that kind of come to mind when reading through the report, and I just want to really harp on what Laurel said earlier about we need to have the right reference point. You can't compare the worst remote work case to the best in-person case. You need to think about organizations at their best using this intentionality, and then organizations at their worst cannot have planning. And so regardless of what they do, you can give them $1 billion in an organization without intentionality, without good culture, still fail. So two of the main points that I want to delve into. First is on some of the productivity effects and thinking about productivity from a very holistic standpoint. So for example, when there isn't a corporate culture where people feel like they can communicate with one another, where they can share experiences with one another, where they're all running in a similar direction, that leads to less engagement, more distractions over the course of the day. People are sometimes looking for more distractions. And so that whittles away at that workday such that even though they might have kind of like 12 hours that they're online, in terms of dedicated time that they're putting towards thinking about the problems that the organization faces, that it might be closer to like 4 hours or so. And so I think thinking about productivity holistically is something that's really important and is just tough to do quantitatively, because think about what researchers have access to. They might have, in the example, Raj Choudhury, who was one of the authors on the USPTO study that you cited, and one of my co-authors, they have patents, and but there's a broader metrics of productivity, the quality of patents. What about other sectors? Think about knowledge workers. How do you measure the quality of an idea? All those sort of factors. One of the exciting things I just want to mention really briefly on this productivity component is, and that you mentioned in the report, is about hybrid work. And so it's not about this either you are fully virtual or fully in person. One of the projects that Raj and I are implementing in India with a large company is we actually randomize the use of going in person and versus staying at home. And so for individuals, we can look at what about people that go in a lot, what about people that go in sometimes, and what about people that like don't really go in at all over the course of an entire month. And we actually found the greatest productivity effects for that hybrid, that middle case. And so we weren't finding an adverse effect of remote work or virtual work. We were just finding some of the greatest benefits kind of in that middle. And so organizations will all have to figure out where is that sweet spot, and that sweet spot will depend, as Nicole mentioned, on the values of the organization, on the mission, on like what are the people actually doing? Do they have to go talk to one another, or is it more independent work? The second point that I really wanted to touch, and I'll be more succinct on the second point, is how do you scale up very, very complicated work? And so as our economy becomes more and more digital and more digitally intensive, there are certain tasks that are easier done in person, but technology can still facilitate the coming together in a virtual environment. And so thinking about how you can use virtual reality to accelerate the learning process. So if one of the employees on the team doesn't know how to write a script in R that does certain data visualization, well, one, there probably will be a program that actually does that for free. But like, let's imagine there's not such a program. Like you might be able to put on like some VR goggles and 20 minutes get a really good tutorial about how to do that. And one of my other faculty colleagues at David Lee at UC Santa Barbara, we're actually working on a project where we provide AI-based recommendations to employees such that you can kind of take a very complicated task, break it up into a bunch of different pieces, and then based on the different strengths on the team, give recommendations to people such that if you excel at this, then you give them kind of this, and then they're all working together in a harmonized fashion. And I didn't do the idea justice, but it's all just illustrative to say that technology can really facilitate the way that we farm out complicated work on a virtual team. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Brent, and just delighted to be here and honored to share the panel with Laurel and Nicole and Matt as well.
Well, thanks, Christos. That's fascinating stuff. And one of the things that it says to me is that this is a huge management challenge. It's not just a challenge for workers, but a challenge for their managers to figure out and to really apply thoughtfully, the tools at hand to help workers succeed in this environment. It isn't just go off and just keep doing what you're doing, but do it from home or do it remotely. It's like how does that remote element shift the way that this work is going to get done? So I want to go back to you, Laurel. And first of all, I want you to just like carte blanche. If you've heard something that you want to react to from the other panels, please do that. But one of my thoughts throughout the last 9 months has been, our fondest hopes being fulfilled, are our worst fears coming true, or is it something in between? I mean, to my mind, the worst fear for employers, as a matter of fact, has always been we're going to lose control. We're going to lose control of our workforce. We won't be able to monitor them. The work won't get done. And that's, I think, has been the primary sort of obstacle to employers being willing to engage in the idea of remote work prior to the pandemic. So that's my question for you. Worst fears, fondest hopes, where did we land on this? And then, of course, respond to the other panels if you've got something else you want to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, again, we need to give that caveat. Well, are we asking that question socially, or are we asking that question professionally? Because those are two very different things. As the report discusses, this really reveals a lot to us as a society, that we say, wait a second, my workplace is my only source of social interaction, and wow, it turns out I really haven't been supporting my personal relationships very well. And it just kind of held up a mirror to us in a lot of ways, in our organizational cultures, like in our productivity and tracking of our employees, that we really are forced into this very uncomfortable position to evaluate what have we been doing, and how much have we been hiding behind proximity. Proximity gives us this false sense of security about unification, about teamwork, about alignment. But are we truly doing those things? And, our employees may be concerned and complaining about feeling lonely right now, but let's be honest, they were probably lonely before too. So we really, what remote work does is not that remote work by itself is completely different and foreign and unique. What it does is it really just creates this very, very clear, concise, transparent organizational model in which there really aren't any places to hide because you don't have that immediate access to each other. You have to improve the places that previously, historically, we've been hiding. So I think, Christos, let's go back to your example of productivity. Everybody assumes that productivity, that statistic about productivity increasing, which by the way is like an average of 35 to 40% higher. I mean, it's a massive statistic. So it's not, what we're assuming is that people are working more productively when they are remote, but that's not necessarily the case as we're experiencing now, right? Like a lot of us have dogs barking and children interrupting and you know, we're burned out. Like, it's not necessarily us that is more productive. It is the operational adjustments that we've had to make in our organization in order to accommodate remote work. So what that means is that we have stronger workflows. So in an office, you corral time and space, right? In a virtual office, you're corralling information. That's what keeps you all unified. So you have to be completely spot on about when is it my turn? When is it your turn? What does a handoff look like? What does this process start to finish? There's no room for observation. You have to articulate that. So workflows are stronger. You also are leveraging asynchronous communication because people are working across different time zones. So you're able to, in this new superpower way, multitask and be helping one person when they're on the other side of the world and you're sleeping, but also working during normal business hours. So we've got these workflows, we've got asynchronous communication, we've got empowerment of the employees that are able to work more autonomously. They are trained to be self-managers because they don't have a manager around. So they're just working more independently in general. And above all, we're measuring results. We're measuring productivity more accurately because we can't see our employees. We can't watch them. Activity is not a thing to us. We have to measure, were you productive? And that's all based on results instead of, are you in this building during these hours? So because of all of those components, that's what increases productivity. And those are all location irrelevant. Those can be helping a business increase productivity, whether their employees are distributed or they're all back in the office.
Thanks, Laurel. And Nicole, I guess my question for you, because of your other research, is how should we think about remote work from the standpoint of social cohesion? You know, is this going to become just another way that Americans divide themselves between those who work remotely and those who don't have that opportunity on the basis of the work that they do? And what do we do about that, if anything? I'm really curious about what your thoughts are.
I want to say to people out there, like, don't get me wrong, I actually do like working remotely because I don't want to actually have to drive to an office. And I find my productivity is very high as a researcher when I can get that time, as Laurel says, to sort of structure better my information flows and sort of do what I do as a technique, which is to cut off those times which I'm not available to be able to be engaged in other remote environments. I'm actually productive. So I do want to speak for those of us who have found our productivity flows go up. But I think that's where the question is, it varies by industry, right? Because I'm in the think tank world. Our whole industry is not necessarily about making widgets, but it's about absorbing all of the things that are happening around us and making sense of it. And, you know, unfortunately, we lived in a crowded space before the pandemic, and we still live in a crowded space. So I can give you, in our particular department, our productivity just skyrocketed in terms of the type of content that's coming out, and probably the same thing in AI, simply because of the nature of work. But in terms of social cohesion, I actually have to say, I think it's really interesting, right? Because first and foremost, Robert Putnam said before the pandemic, way before a lot of things, that we were bowling alone anyway as a civil society. So it's not to say, as Laurel said, that we actually were in these gangs and tribes of folks prior to the pandemic. In many respects, many of us have found a way to actually leverage technology in its previous form to just stay by ourselves anyway. I mean, all you have to do is look at the metro going to work and nobody's talking to each other. We're all actually engaged in whatever digital device that we have, whether it's a movie, music, or something else. I think what's interesting, though, is the extent to which people have adopted actually new cultural norms because of the pandemic. And this, I think, is less related to the report and more related to the fact that people were still hungry for some type of affiliation or association. So I know that there are groups of women that do happy hours, once a week just to check in with each other. My own personal family is now doing Zoom reunions where folks are actually getting together across the country who haven't seen each other for 10, 13 years. Those kinds of things have happened in ways that I think the pandemic dictated that. And it may actually question what Laurel has said, where some people are starting to now sort of reverse course on the fact that they have been disassociated from family members and friends, that they're using this opportunity to develop new cultural norms that I think if they find ways for us to go back to work, people are going to want to continue. I can't tell you how many people anecdotally are like, I've connected with folks that I've not seen for 13, 14, 15 years via a Zoom call, or we just started messaging each other simply because we have that time to do it. And we can't go to concerts and we can't go to movies. So what's the next best thing to do? Call up somebody you haven't talked to for 15 years and catch up. But the question becomes, and I think this is really the value of this conversation, is what does work mean in the United States? To what extent has work always looked like what it looks like remotely? To what extent do we have work really break up some of the social norms that really create the fullness of people when it comes to quality of life? We constantly hear people talk about self-care. I think there's a lot of that going on. There's not only the pandemic that has affected the way we work, but there are people who are sitting down at Christmas who have an empty seat, as President-elect Biden says, because someone has been affected. Myself personally, we've lost 4 people. Those kinds of things also happened in this pandemic that, to a certain extent, Brent, to your question, it could have reversed the trend and made us much more polarized. And of course, we see that based on our affinity groups and our ideological preferences. But I would suggest in certain respects, based on Putnam's work as a sociologist, that we actually are seeing people get closer together in some respects, because you cannot see that person. I've not seen my mother, who lives in New York, for the last 9 months. And so I've had to think of different ways to connect. And I'm actually connecting with her more because these kinds of means are actually more affordable than me drive, or more accessible than driving 4 hours for a visit for a weekend. And so again, I think for the other 2 scholars on this event, I think that's also an interesting thing we need to look at, right? In terms of what this also did to remind people, particularly employers, that we do have other lives that get in the way, that, again, based on the traditional structure of work, have not been highlighted, Brent, to your point, and have created less cohesion within communities and families as a result.
Fantastic, thanks. Christos, one of the big questions that I have about the distributed workforce is around innovation. I know that in my own work life, when I'm in a building with my team of people or the other scholars, there's a tremendous amount of business that gets transacted kind of on the fly, right? It's the quick conversation. It's let me ask you about this. That loss of spontaneity really seems to me to be one of the big losses, and it's not easily bridged. Or maybe not bridged at all by the technology tools that we have, in terms of fostering that kind of rapid exchange of ideas and information that I think drives the innovation, the process of innovation. Have you thought about that issue? What do you make of it?
Yeah, definitely. I'll probably cross-apply some of what Laurel mentioned and just start there, that there's a lot of remote work arrangements in the marketplace that are not the best manifestations of what remote work should look like, and that there are tools out there that help. But I think your point is that even after you do things right, that there's still some things that technology just is not a perfect substitute for. And that's where I think hybrid work arrangements are probably a good thing, because just as Nicole was mentioning, people save a lot of time by not having to commute into work. And I mean, in DC, you can go 3 miles and you spend 30 something minutes. So you can save a lot of time by only going in maybe once a week or twice a week, and then having very tactical meetings on those days. And then you split up the work such that on the other 2 or 3 days, you're really doing kind of that deep work that Cal Newport talks about. So number one is just what techniques can organizations adapt to kind of split up and not just do a fully online, fully virtual versus fully in person. The second thing comes down to what are the tasks that organization needs to successfully complete in order to deliver value to their consumer. And so every organization is going to have different required tasks. My parents run a Greek restaurant in Phoenix, Arizona, and so the task of cooking food is going to be very different than the task of writing a research paper. And so I think organizations, and this is something that I'm working with Gallup over, is like these kind of human capital inventories. Every organization needs to understand what human capital do we need in order to make our customer overjoyed. And so just to delve a little bit deeper into this, think about a task that, like Brent, when you're talking with a collaborator, a co-author with Matt, it might be easier to do that in person, just because you don't want to, like, Slack is great, but like Slack can sometimes be a little bit annoying where you just get notifications and you're like, you want to work, but then you're getting notifications, and yes, you can turn them off, but then some. So it's not perfect, but being in person together and just having that ability to share a lunch or something like that is a different experience versus, and that's a very collaborative thing of like working on a paper versus something else that is like writing code. And so the beautiful thing in a lot of the work that we do is it requires both. It's not one or the other. And so I think organizations just need to better understand what human capital do they need. And a lot of organizations have gotten by over the years without taking those inventories. I think Laurel mentioned something earlier. It's just that this has revealed a lot of things that we haven't done, maybe personally, or organizations haven't done. And I think it's coming time where organizations can't kick the can down the road that much longer without doing such an inventory, without kind of looking in the mirror and saying, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And taking an honest evaluation at it. So with that, I'll turn it back to anyone else that wants to chime in.
I think it's interesting. It just piqued my interest on. Can you hear me?
No.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. You piqued my interest on something that I'm sitting here and I was like, wow, what you said was so powerful. You know, in many respects too, when you talked about, you know, when you at the workplace, you actually get to speak to the person there. I also find, because we're also in this space where many of these meetings are conducted via video, that it actually has done some democratization though of the airtime that is actually in meetings. And I have found that to be the case because you can see everybody's face. And you as the person, if you've ever noticed being on a Zoom meeting versus an event, there is this shared airtime that people get to actually participate. And there is also this cadence that comes because of people's fear of talking over each other or talking too much, of the person who is putting the meeting together, checking in to make sure everyone has said something. I have actually found that to be really interesting because I've been on several meetings where in person, it would have been the same person speaking over and over again, taking up the airtime. In the office, there will be people who will be omitted from the dialogue because they're not the normal go-to. But that's one area that I would suggest to all of us that we think about as well. You know, the extent to which we're also learning something about the democratization of our inputs and the extent to which that democratization, because we're online, because we have to speak to each other, because more people are opting for video versus conference call, that you're sort of placed on the spot to make sure people have participated because you can see everybody, which I think is very interesting. If you put that in the office, it goes back to what Laurel said. Where do people hide? Sometimes people hide because they know even if they go into that meeting, they're not going to be heard, right? And sometimes people hide proactively, and sometimes people are hidden because they're not the normal suspects to be able to collaborate with. So I just wanted to put that out there because I think, you know, the whole report's basis of there's so much more work to be done. That could also be interesting, not necessarily in a job that may be more manufacturing based or blue collar based, but I do think in areas we have the most problems with productivity and diversity, it is interesting to see how that actually plays out via these new media.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
completely. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead,
Brent. Laurel. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that this is absolutely accurate and circles back to what we were talking about before. Like you were saying, Nicole, of, you know, I'm feeling more connected to people than I was before, even though I'm in less proximity because of this. Like in distributed companies that everybody has now experienced throughout our society is when all of the convenience is stripped away, we're left with this feeling of what is absolutely necessary to preserve. So, Brent, those hallway interactions that you're talking about of just spontaneously bumping into each other and developing a great idea. Okay, we don't have access to that experience, but what is at the core of that is absolutely necessary to preserve? And that is a great conversation between two people that feel very aligned and think very creatively together. Is that possible to replicate? Absolutely. Do we replicate it in remote work? Absolutely. Multiple times a day, I ping my coworkers and say, hey, can I just have like 15 minutes? I just need to talk through something with somebody else, right? And we get on a Zoom and I'm sharing my screen and I'm like, okay, this is what I'm thinking. Give me some feedback, or just talking it out together in a synchronous way. That helps so much. So yes, we still have access to that innovation. Yes, we still have access to organizational culture. Yes, we still have access to, to design thinking and inspiration and interpersonal relationships. They just exist in a different way because we have to, just like we're doing socially, have to strip it back to what is absolutely necessary to preserve and start to enforce that and activate it in a different way than we're used to.
So this is very challenging to me because I'm a stodgy old man now, but because I really, to me, there's just something irreplaceable about in-person contact, and I need to look into the science of this, but 90% of our communication, of course, is nonverbal, while 100% of our communication in this environment, or almost 100% of it, is entirely verbal, and so we only get shoulders up picture of how somebody's reacting to us, and there's just a tremendous amount of loss in that, I think. But
let me clarify that I agree with you. So even
Yeah.
fully distributed companies that have no office space whatsoever, they still get together in person a minimum of once a year. Like, it is irreplaceable. And it's been a big, big hindrance for distributed teams when they have not been able to get together in person in the past year. So 100%, yes, what we're saying is, yes, we absolutely need to have in-person contact. No questions asked. But it's when and how often. Like, do I need to be sitting in the next room to that person when I'm writing a report and they're writing a report? No. But do I need to be together with that person when we're doing some, massive road mapping and strategic planning for our team? Yes. So it's just a matter of when.
Yeah, good distinction. I want to give Matt a chance to get in here too, since he contributed so heavily to the development of this report and has thought very deeply about it. And I'll just be very frank and say, I don't think we would have this report if Matt hadn't said, hey, we need to do this report. So Matt, what do you think after having listened to this conversation and kind of the ideas that you brought in at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you everybody for the chance to speak with you all. I think this is really interesting because Brent and I have been in kind of our own little silo thinking about this ourselves. And, I've only been in the workforce for about 4 years or so, and 3 of those years have been spent remotely. And I love it. And I think I'm a researcher, so I can say it's very productive for me to be, and I've come to master the brainstorming over virtual channels better over the course of time. I do think I agree with Brent that doing it in person is hard to replace, but it gets better over time. But I think the one thing that really intrigued me about wanting to do this was particularly about our relationship with employers and our relationship with the 40-hour work week. In particular, I have always questioned why exactly is it 40 hours that we have to work in a week. And maybe for a researcher, that's easier to say than someone who's maybe a customer service rep. I'd just love to hear really quickly, though, anybody who has thoughts on this, like how this remote work evolution changes our relationship with things like the 40-hour work week. It changes our relationship with our employers who are no longer over our shoulder necessarily. Would just love to hear a last minute thought on that idea.
I mean, well, I would say this. I mean, I think it goes back to Matt. This is like my last one, and I'm having audio problems. I don't know. I told everybody it's my last Zoom webinar for the year after about 300. So I would think it's interesting to your point. I do think that it does sort of substantiate, well, why do we need a 48-hour week? But I think what you heard from all of us is if we're not going to do a 40-hour week, we don't need an 80-hour week. And that's sort of what remote work becomes if you don't have values or structure or norms around what is accessible. I mean, at Brookings, the norm is usually at 6 o'clock, nobody's in the office physically. Now we're seeing people work on the weekends and work through the evening. And I think it goes back to this whole productivity idea. When are your employees most productive? How much time are they putting in? Can you measure that? And honestly, I want to put it out there as a person who deals with technology. We're not completely divorced from our employers. There are unfortunately some employers that still use your laptop that is employee owned to surveil your time, you know, how much time you're on there. And there's still people that still spend a lot of time saying, you know, I need to take a lunch break, but I need to stay logged in for whatever reason. Federal government sort of started this. And I think we're going to see that go into the private sector even more, that your log on time is sort of going to quantify your hours. But I do think, man, I think at the end of the day, a 40-hour work week is just as, you know, who knows what the rationales of these do around it. The key thing for companies should be productivity, but productivity that makes sense for everybody. And that's something I've shared at Brookings. Like, we cannot, as a company, say we want everybody to work remotely and not have the values espoused from executive leadership on what does that mean, so that we actually have a balanced community and one that, you know, ranks as a place where people want to work because they feel that they have some control over their personal lives in the midst of their work lives. So I think that's going to be, I mean, Laura, I don't know about you, but I think that's going to be the question for a lot of employers who are considering, like, hey, this works really well. We saved a lot of money. We didn't have this. What are the values that are core to productivity versus what are the values that are just getting people, like Matt said, on the clock?
Brent.
Yeah, sorry. We are officially at an hour, but I did want to give Laurel and Christos a chance to give us any last thoughts before we adjourn this conversation. So Laurel, any final ideas that you wanted to make sure got across to the audience?
You know, I think, you know, most of it, I've said my piece. To respond to your question, Matt, I think what we see operationally and infrastructurally is that in fully distributed teams, there is a much higher higher rate of hours not being tracked, because what we're measuring more than time are results. And so the activity and time spent on the activity is less important than did it get done by the deadline period. Great. And it's up to you to self-manage and enforce those boundaries. We enforce the boundaries of, you know, daily schedules as a company, but it's up to you to, you know, control your ebb and flow of energy in order to meet that deadline and to set the appropriate benchmarks. So in that circumstance, there's a lot of people that choose to work a lot faster and have a lot shorter hour work weeks. What it also does is opens the door for neurodiversity. People that work at a slower pace can also achieve higher levels of promotions and as well as more complex work, knowing that they have the speed that they need, or I'm sorry, have the time that they need to perform at the speed that they need. And so that's exciting to watch. Not that we're, you know, forcing people into 80-hour work weeks, but it is an accommodating factor that is exciting to watch and enforce with boundaries. So I think with all of this, it's just important to see and understand that this is an opportunity. A lot of people are feeling very constrained. This was an unexpected change, and it's been very overwhelming and very frustrating for us individually, socially, and organizationally. However, if we can break ourselves out of this mindset of this is happening to me, and really switch that into an opportunistic mindset and think, what can we change? What can we achieve if we stop feeling trapped in the way that we used to be? Like, are there changes that we can make that will really enhance different elements of our organization? Then it can really become something exciting and special.
Christos, last word for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, amen to that. I echo all of that, and just to elaborate a tiny bit more, is that there are all these tools that technology makes available to us, and I mean, it puts some more responsibility on us. And just to look at the fact that you can learn almost anything by, I mean, you can go on YouTube. There's plenty of companies, DataCamp, Coursera, edX, et cetera, that you could get knowledge at scale for very low prices. And that's injecting more competition into higher education, honestly, is that it's not just the Harvards, it's also these ed tech companies. And so I think it's this call to action of really don't forget that while we are in a pretty big trial as a country, as a world, there's also a lot of opportunities available. And just to always be thinking every day, reflecting, like, what did I do well? Did I use my time well? What do I want to change tomorrow? And that's something that, I mean, regardless of whether we're in a pandemic or not, we should all be doing, but especially now with the tools that we have.
That is such a great word to end on. I mean, I think that, you know, one of the, for those of us who have been thrust into this remote work environment, I think that one of the take homes is that it has allowed us to assume greater ownership of what we do rather than deferring to in-person hierarchies that can control more and influence more. It's like, I'm the only one who can make my job happen, and I've got to be really smart about how I do that. And that's in the long term, that is such a good thing for the economy. It's such a good thing for individuals as they assume that ownership, that agency as it relates to their own work. So I want to thank Laurel and Nicole and Christos for their time this morning. You've all just made great and insightful contributions. I am so excited about this topic. I think we've got a lot to learn, and just figuring out what we have learned over the last 9 months, I think, is a worthy enterprise for all of us to be engaged in. So again, thank you so much. I wish you the happiest of holidays, and hope that some of that is in person and not just remote.
Thanks for having us. It's been a pleasure.
You bet. Bye all.